Here I have a simple contract with one state variable called val of type uint256. It has two functions, a function to set this value and a function to get this value. We've already seen how to call these functions from our account. We will deploy the contract and then use the Remix IDE to simply call the functions. But how can we call these functions from another contract? The simplest way to communicate with different contracts is by interface. So in this video, I'll explain how to declare an interface and how to use an interface to communicate with this contract. Okay, to begin with, I've created another Vyper file called call interface. Inside here, we'll declare our interface and then call this contract. So first, I'm going to copy this function definition and then I'll paste it here. Also, there's a state variable called val, which we will be able to call later. So I'll also copy this and then paste it here. These are the functions that are available in the contract test interface. To declare interface, we'll say interface, and let's name this interface iTest. Okay, so we have three functions that we can call. The first one, I'll say this is def val, and when we call this function, it's going to return a uint256. To declare that this function is going to be read-only, we'll say view. Okay, we have two more functions. We have the function setVal, which we will like to call later on. And this function is not a read-only function. It's going to write to the state variable val. So to declare that this is not a read-only function, we say non-payable. Okay, and the last example, getVal. Again, this will be a read-only function that's going to return uint256. Since this is a read-only function, I'll declare it as view. Okay, so that's how you would declare an interface. Now how will we call these functions? First, I want to store the address of the test interface contract that we're going to be calling. So I'll call this test. This will be public. Now we can either simply store the address of the test contract, or we can store it as the interface. For example, we can say iTest, and then inside the constructor, we say, for the input, we'll pass in the address of the test contract, test address, and then say self.test is equal to iTest with the address of the test. Maybe this is a little bit confusing, so I'll change this to test address, test ADDR. So this is how you store the interface at the address, test address, inside a state variable called test. Okay, let's try calling some of the functions that are declared inside the interface. So for example, let's try calling the function setValue. So I'll say external def, let's call this test setVal, and it's going to take in a single input, val uint256, and then we'll simply call the function setVal. So say self.test.setVal, passing in the input val. Okay, now when we make an external call to another contract, we need to declare this as an external call. So say ext call. Okay, so this is how you call the function setVal on the test contract. How about we call the function getVal? To call the function getVal, what we'll need to do is something similar to this. So say at external. Since this is going to be a read-only function, I'll declare as view, and then say def test getVal. And then to call this function getVal, again, we'll say self.test.getVal. To declare to Vyper that this is an external call, but it is a read-only call, we say static call. And we want to return a uint256 here, so say uint256. And then over here, say return. These are the simple examples of how to call another contract by using interface. Let's try compiling the contract and then testing out these functions. First, let's try compiling this contract. Okay, it compiles. Okay, going back, I first want to deploy this test interface contract. So I'll compile this again. And then we'll deploy the test interface contract. Okay, here it is. Now going back to our call interface contract, compile this, and then we'll deploy this. Make sure that now you've selected call interface. And to deploy this, we'll need to pass in the address of the test interface contract. I'll copy this address and then paste it here and then call transact. Okay, now our contract is deployed. Let's try calling some functions. What happens when we call the state variable test? Well, it's going to return the address of the test interface contract. Okay, what happens if we call test get val? It returns a 0. How about we set it? Let's set it to 1, 2, 3, call transact, and then call test get val again, and it returns 1, 2, 3. Next, I want to move on to more complex examples. For example, how would you call interface without storing it in a state variable? How would you get an address of an interface that's been initialized with a specific address? How to send ether, and how to assign return value. So these are the examples that I will cover. Let's start with the first one. How to call interface without storing it in a state variable. Here it's calling self.interface. To replace this, what you would need to do is simply say iTest, and inside here we'll need to pass in the address of the contract that we want to call. For example, we'll need to pass in the address of the test contract that we want to call as input, test addr address. And over here we will put in the address, for example, test addr. Okay, so that's the first example. The next example is how will we get the address of the interface. Here we initialize this state variable test as iTest, having the address test addr. But given this test interface, how will we get the address that the interface was initialized with? Well, we can say test.address. In this case, it will be self.test.address. And to show you this, let's say addr of type address is equal to self.test.address. Okay, how about sending ether? How will we send ether? To show you this example, we'll have to modify our test interface contract. So let's say I have another function. I'll call it setVal with message value, and this will be payable. And then I'll create another state variable so that we can see how much ether was sent to this function. Say message val public uint 256. Then over here, after setting the state variable val, you'll say self.message_val is equal to message.value. Now that we have a payable function, let's go back to our contract called call interface and then declare this function inside the interface. I'll first copy this, then back inside our call interface contract, I'll paste the function over here. We need to declare a function setVal with message value as payable. And to do this, it's simple. You just need to say payable. Okay, and to test this out, I'm gonna copy this function, the function that tested setVal, paste it here. And this will be payable since we're gonna be sending some ether to this function. And then I'll call this function test message val. Then it's gonna call the function setVal with message value. And how will we send ether when we call this function? Well, to specify the amount of ether to send when we call this function, we say value is equal to, and then specify the amount that we want to send. For this example, we will just send message.value, which will be the amount of ether that was sent when this function is called. Okay, so we'll test this out later. And the last example is how we assign a return value. For example, let's go back to our test interface contract. And then let's say that after we set the value, we return the current value, return val. So now this will return a uint 256, and let's call setVal return val. Okay, now we need to declare this inside our interface. So I'll copy part of this function, going back to our call interface contract, paste it here, and this function will be non-payable. Okay, let's try calling this function. So I'll copy this again, and then paste it here. Let's rename this function test return val. And the function that we need to call is setVal return val. SetVal and then return val. We'll return a value, and to assign a variable to the value that was returned when we call the function setVal return val, the type that is returned is uint256. So let's say b for the return value, type will be uint256, is equal to, make our external call using the interface iTest at the contract address test addr, call the function testVal return val, and then passing the input val. Okay, so this is how you will capture our output. I also want to see what the return value was, so let's just simply capture this in a state variable. Say b is equal to public uint256, and then here I'll say self.b is equal to, and then remove the type annotation. Okay, let's try calling these functions. So first, I want to redeploy this test contract. So compile this, go to deployment tab, and then clear out all the contracts that we deployed in the previous example. Make sure that you select test interface and then deploy it. Okay, once the contract is deployed, let's now select call interface contract, compile it, go to deployment tab, make sure you selected call interface, and then to deploy it, we'll need to pass the address of the test contract. So copy this address, paste it here, then hit transact. So now let's try calling the function test return val and test message value. Let's start with test message value. For the contract address, I'll just use this contract address, then paste it here for the value, let's say 123. And we also can send some amount to Vyper. So let's send 99 weight and then call the function transact. Okay, we can see that the transaction was successful. Now going back to the test interface contract, when the function test val with message value is called, it's going to store the amount of Vyper that was sent into a state variable called message value. So let's check what the value is. We expect this to be equal to 99. Call the state variable message value, and we get the value 98. I guess there's a bug in the remix ID. Okay, moving on. Let's call the function test return val. Again, it's going to take in the address of the contract that we're going to be calling, which is this address. Paste it for the value, let's send 456. Call transact. Okay, so the return value will be stored in V, which is 456, and the value that was set will be stored in the test contract. Call it and get 456.